So, Matt, I guess we can start with what we're doing every day, really, at work is like what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the Ukrainians have had some tactical successes on the battlefield, most notably with regards to their kind of anti-air systems being able to remain functioning this late in the war, despite perceptions that Russia would kind of immediately gain complete total air superiority. And because of that, the
Right.
Ukrainians, particularly using drones, have been able to have some effect on Russian forces, but we haven't really seen any signs that at least for the past couple days, that the Ukrainian drones are still operating. And so, really, the situation for Ukrainian forces is very desperate.
Mm,
And so, despite kind of exceeding expectations in some ways, there's a lot of doubts that it'll really do enough to make a strategic kind of difference on the battlefield and kind of prevent this war from becoming even more brutal, more civilian casualties. So Russia's kind of given up on its blitzkrieg idea that it would kind of suddenly force a change of government through intimidation, and now it's
right.
realizing that it's going to have to really seize and occupy most of Ukraine. So that's kind of where we are right now.
Right.
Obviously, my question for you is about China, and it's about kind of China's how it's looking at this war, and how. I mean, I guess there's two separate questions here. It's what does China want to happen in this war, and kind of how is it reacting to the war itself? And then I guess my really broader second question is, what is the feeling in Beijing about the bottom line is that Russia is going to have to become so much more dependent and cooperative in China in so many ways, from technologically, economically. And is that something that people in the Politburo in Beijing is excited about? This idea that they're basically going to have one of the largest and most powerful near dependencies of a major power in the world. And does that give them anxiety, or is that something that really excites them?
Yeah, well, I guess I can deal with the first question first. I mean, China just wants this to be over. Um, this was, in my estimation, this was either a surprise for Beijing or it was way more than Beijing had bargained for. Perhaps Putin had said, "Listen, it'll be a quick Donbass thing, real quick and dirty, and we'll get what we want. The West, meaning NATO and the U.S., will lose face, and we'll get out of there. And you, China, will also benefit because you also have this view that the Western liberal democratic world is trying to hold China and Russia back." That obviously, like you just mentioned, like that hasn't played out. Now China's stuck with every day having to go, the foreign ministry having to go out and say, "This is our position on Ukraine." If you look at their comments, they're almost all the questions are about Ukraine, and it's just deferring, deferring. This is what we said before, deferring, just waiting for this to be done. So I think China's sort of in a nightmare scenario where they're realizing that the diplomatic isolation of Russia is bleeding onto China, and China has enough diplomatic problems right now. So
Right.
that's it's not a good situation for China. And I would say, as far as like the grand strategic side of it, is Beijing excited about Russia needing China more than ever? If they are, they're not showing it in any
Mhm.
in any forum I've seen, and it's shown in the state media too, in people's daily. They're just not talking about Ukraine as much as possible, and I think that's because this really did not go the way they had thought it would go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, perhaps long term, China has always had it in the back of its mind that the Russian partnership is great for now, but eventually we're going to have to see who's the bigger power here, and we, China, don't plan on losing that discussion.
Right.
um, but I don't think that means right now China's excited about this. I think they realize that those long-term strategic discussions are just that, long term. And right now, it's just a nightmare for China
Yeah,
diplomatically.
we've got a really interesting question from PE
Mm,
Duelist, one of our listeners, and this is actually a question that we got in response to one of our pieces recently.
mm,
Do you think China could push Russia to end the war? There was an interesting report in the U.S. media about the Biden administration making kind of an abortive attempt at something like this, which failed for a
right.
number of
Many attempts.
many attempts. And then even recently, I think there's this, I think personally, I think it's a misconception that I think belies kind of a certain naivete about even global superpowers like China, this idea that they can use their economic heft or their relationship with Russia to immediately sweep in
Mm.
and like solve just solve this whole issue very quickly. When in reality, this is a Russian-Ukrainian issue that is could not be
Right.
negotiated for years for a reason. And so this idea that China
Yeah.
or the U.S. or anybody else can sweep in and kind of fix it all in a matter of days or something is I
Yeah,
think is an
play
idea
matchmaker.
we can move away from. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I can't blame the Biden administration for trying necessarily, but I think they underestimated just how much China views itself in strategic competition with the West right now, which means they do not want any sort of Western win. They do not want to lose their Russian partnership, and they, Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party. And the CCP is incredibly paranoid that the US is constantly trying to drive a wedge between Russia, its closest partner, and China. So anything the US throws to Beijing, Beijing reads it as, oh, how exactly are they trying to split us apart? Oh, I see what you did here. I'm not falling for this, right? And now that they've sort of committed themselves to it, like we're going to support Russia, even if we never technically say we support an invasion. Um, this is what China does. They have a narrative and they have a very hard time, China being Beijing again, very hard time switching. They just commit to it full bore. And they have shown nine once the invasion started, once it became, it clearly wasn't Donbass, but it's more of Ukraine. And at no point have they changed this. So I don't blame the Biden administration for trying. But China's backed itself into a narrative box here, and they're not showing any signs of changing.
And you were, I think you were telling me the other day that this is also a political liability for Xi personally in kind of the upper echelons of the Chinese political
Right,
system.
right.
If something happens in the Russo-Chinese relationship and it leads to another split, that's going to be considered kind of bad within the party, and it's a political liability more than anything else. Is that still kind of
Right.
correct?
Yeah, I mean, you know as well as I do, there's been this like Xi Putin bromance for like the last 10 years. And so this relationship is very high level and it's very close and it's very personal in China. So Xi Jinping personally is also not willing to just ditch Putin. I bet he kind of wishes he had made things more clear back in February 4th. Said, no, if this is what you're planning, I'll pass. Please don't do this. But yeah, it's a sensitive year for Xi Jinping. He's trying to go into his third term later on in the year, which is unprecedented in recent memory. And there's already enough criticism of him. There's media moguls, there's politicians, everyone. And then they say, hey, maybe we're not doing the best thing by being so aggressive and so wolf warrior diplomacy on every front with the U.S. and the West. Um, and so there's already this internal dissent, and this doesn't help that. And I'm sure it's similar with like Putin, his legacy going forward. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an open question. Obviously, within Russia today, this is trying. Putin is kind of with force creating this new reality that is, supposed to persist for a long time. But I think that there's,
Mm,
a lot of doubt about, the long term popularity and viability of what's going on right now within Russia,
right.
particularly amongst kind of, elite circles and kind of affluent middle classes and Russian cities. This is not considered in their interest, and so in those, as
Mm,
we know from the kind of previous history of revolution and social dissent, that kind of those people are some of the people who are more capable in the long term of really affecting societal change. So I think it comes with certain risks. I think another thing I'm really interested in this situation vis-a-vis China is, I mean, so before this, there was a statement by the Chinese foreign minister that something along the lines of, China, recognizes every country's kind of territorial integrity and
right.
sovereignty, including
Right.
Ukraine. And my fear is that Russia is going to do two things that are going to be very blatantly potentially violate that. Either attempt to establish a puppet regime in Kiev, which will not be recognized by most of the international community, I should say. So China has to either recognize this Ukrainian government or stick with the previous one, or Russia could try to partition Ukraine into like an East and West Ukraine, and then would China recognize that at least the puppet regime in the east of the country as a new country or something like that. This is particularly interesting, remembering the fact that China, like again most of the world, does not recognize Crimea as
Right.
Russia.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would think it would be so embarrassing for Russia if Russia goes to with either of those two options, and then China will not even go along with recognize either of those new entities. So I think that's a potential danger to look out for here.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree. I'd say China's narrative has shifted a little bit. They've stopped talking quite so much about Ukrainian sovereignty and more about Russian concerns, more about this is basically the West's fault. You pushed Russia up into a wall, and lo and behold, they lashed out, right? But they're still not supports invasion. Uh, as far as the narrative going forward, if Russia goes a bridge too far, um, China is going to try and manage its partnerships as best it can to protect its economy. That's its main goal in all of this. Is it doesn't want to be lumped in with Russia. It doesn't want to lose Russia either because it needs that energy inflow.
Yeah.
It's one of China's few partners in the world, right? But they're going to act very Beijing. That is going to act very self-defense. Very don't allow anything else to further add burdens onto the Chinese economy this year. So I think they're honestly playing it day by day and just hoping they don't wake up to worse news than the day before, which is not a great plan in my opinion, but it's what they have when they're dealing with heavy unknowns.
I'll address this question we have on screen real quick. Does it lead to the overthrow of Putin? Unfortunately, I think that I mean, if in the past that scenario was 0%, I mean, maybe now it's 1 or 2%. It's still extremely unlikely, and it wouldn't. I don't think it would be kind of a at this time. I'm doubtful that it would be a kind of a popular protest. It would be, I think, something like a palace coup where Russian security services move against, blame the military, and say that Putin had been misled. Something like that related to that, I think, is more likely than a popular uprising.
Hmm.
Although protest potential is certainly on the horizon. Chase, I think the other thing we should definitely touch on here is how China, how this affects China Taiwan. Right, this is a very popular topic
Right?
right
Yeah.
now. I think that I think we talked about this the other day that China, it probably doesn't affects China's near term thinking, and China wants to see how this turns out. Right, they need to see
Sure.
this works before they can incorporate it into their thinking
Right.
on Taiwan.
Yeah.
Is that kind of your general feel?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's in my opinion, it's a surprise they didn't want. If it was something they lightly planned for, meaning the Donbass, then it has gone way over their expectations in a bad way, and they're like, no, never mind, we don't want any of this. So there's Beijing's certainly watching, and China has a history of doing that, of living vicariously through other countries' military engagements. They let them do some giant campaign and see, okay, how did that play out for them? They did this with the U.S. in Iraq, with the U.S. back in Desert Storm. They watch these major new military campaigns and they learn. I think what China is learning from this is, yeah, Taiwan could have some serious ramifications. I mean, Beijing knew this before, seeing that Russia is basically a pariah now and is getting cut off from almost everything. That's a high price. And Taiwan has always been sort of a more political and strategic goal. Like it doesn't make a ton of sense. It gives China a little bit more strategic room in the near seas. That's nice, military perspective. It was always this thing that China was going to have to do. There were going to be high costs, but hopefully China could accept it. The world would move on quickly. And then that's another thing China's going to be watching is, does the world move on quickly from Russia? Do these sanctions fall off pretty quickly and Russia in a year or so is basically in the same spot it is today? Or is Russia's economy seriously hindered for the next decade?
Yeah.
So that'll also inform China's logic about Taiwan. But I agree. I don't think this pushes China to see, oh well, Russia did it in Ukraine. Therefore, while everyone's distracted, we're going to go try something similar in Taiwan, because they're just seeing everything happening to Russia and they say, I don't want to be part of that. Yeah.
Right. Right. And I mean, I think that the question in relation to that for me is, if so, I mean, the analysts say that Russia's economy is going to contract, massively this quarter and this year, something like 7% GDP decline. I mean, what can we even think about what that would mean for Chinese internal political dynamics if something like a GDP contraction of that magnitude were to take place in China? I mean, I imagine that the Chinese Communist Party would have all kinds of political concerns about that, and it would have a certain difficulty maintaining control on
Certainly.
society.
No, I mean that's the grand bargain that China has always had with the people. Like, we'll make sure your livelihood keeps improving significantly year after year as long as you shut up about politics, right? So China was able to survive it during COVID, right? They had a year of dropping growth, but it was because the world was going through this off thing, and it wasn't like China did something necessarily. Some would dispute that, but it wasn't that the Chinese government screwed up so badly. It's that the world's in a bad place right now. So sure, we had a bad growth year, but yeah, I mean, if China had something similar to what's looking like it's going to happen to Russia, there would be some serious political consequences, if not some sort of like elite upheaval. The Chinese Communist Party, in my opinion, is not going anywhere either way. But yeah, there'd be some serious questions about who's in power and if they're doing a good job,
Yeah,
which are questions that the Chinese Communist Party does not like having to field.
right. That makes sense.
You know,
I mean, one of the other things I'm at least looking at here is what this means for future Russian-Chinese military cooperation. A
hmm.
lot of the kind of military analysts have been pointing out potential issues in Russian equipment, Russian practices, Russian doctrine. We know that for decades, Moscow and Beijing have kind of worked closely in this area, and there was some speculation that some of Russia's tire issues, for example, may have been related to
Right.
below
Yep.
standard Chinese tires and so on. So I'm wondering if this kind of makes some kind of a tension in Russian Chinese military cooperation. So definitely something else I'm looking out for.
Yeah. I'd say it's certainly a potential. I would say there's a greater chance of change in doctrine, and change in how China views what an invasion would look like, rather than what particular assets or arms they're purchasing from Russia. Um, I don't doubt that that might change in the future as well, but I think more of it will be this doctrine of just how easy a quick and dirty slash fait accompli invasion is, especially because Taiwan would be like amphibious, which just adds more difficulty to
Oh
all of this. If Russia thought mud was difficult, like how are the waves doing? That would be even worse. So
yeah,
I think it'll be more doctrine than anything going forward.
yeah,
The China relationship in general, I don't think it's going anywhere. I mean, you could see this would be a great time for China to ditch Russia. Like, everyone would understand, no one would blame them, but they're sticking by Russia's side through this very difficult time. So I think that's a good sign that going forward, since China doesn't have very many other partners, to be a great partner to keep by their side. Especially, and I mentioned this earlier, but I want to repeat it: as long as strategic competition with the U.S. goes on, China doesn't really see like ditching the Russian partnership as an option. You have to, in that, this is the same thing in the Cold War, right? There was trilateral between the US, Russia, or the Soviet Union and China, and they were always trying to play other two off against the other partner. So if China can keep Russia, they have a better chance against the US, and that rivalry, in my opinion, is not going anywhere anytime soon.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Is there any other kind of issues we wanted to touch on here?
Um, yeah, let me check. I have a list of questions that I thought were interesting. There was one about military adventurism, which I wanted your opinion on. And we had briefly touched on this the other day about, would Russia like to see this sort of brand of see what you want, go after it, uh, uh, preemptively protect your security, right? That they're doing in Ukraine. Would Russia like to see that as a model, sort of projected in Asia, with China acting similarly or its partners acting similarly? Or is this just kind of like it's a very internal thing that Russia is doing for its own environment, but it's not necessarily the standard that Russia would like to see in the world? Is this return to sort of like, you want something? Well, go for it.
Yes, precisely. I mean, in Moscow, amongst kind of the foreign policy community and certain Russian politicians, that this was a justification for a supporting argument for what they're doing in Ukraine. This idea that us doing this will speed some sort of collapse of the Western, the current global liberal world order, however you want to call it, and that if we can kind of take the first Jenga block out, then then many other countries will start to look around and say, "Oh my God, well look, maybe we should be pursuing our own national interest as ruthlessly as Russia is." And then the U.S. And Europe will have so many fires that going on around the world that they won't be able to put them all out at the same time. Something that's the
Mm.
thinking. I don't think it'll necessarily come to a fruition, but there was absolutely this idea that now
Mm.
other countries will kind of think about what are some ways. Let's be bolder in how we think about pushing back against U.S. overreach or whatever. So they're hoping it'll happen. We'll see, if we start to see things like that.
How do you see Russia responding, or I would say Russia acting going in the next year in Central Asia, right? Because we saw Kazakhstan and the intervention of the CSTO. Now we're seeing Ukraine. I mean, and obviously Russia is not going to want to have too many fires going at a time, but Central Asia has always been this sort of China-Russia competition for influence. Right? They're
Yeah.
partners, but they both want to have great influence over this region. So how do you see Russia approaching that now that they sort of have a reputation, black eye over Ukraine?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting kind of speculation on this question, and it relates to the events in Kazakhstan in January, which more and more people are starting to speculate that maybe there was something more there going on than meets the eye, and a lot of the implications are that Tokayev, the leader of Kazakhstan, is really trying to minimize daylight between Kazakhstan and Russia.
Hmm.
And I think the reason for that is that the Russians and even the Kazakhs themselves know that something similar to what's going on in Ukraine, obviously not exactly the same because it's in Central Asia and it's not in
Right,
NATO, and
right,
it's, but there's this long time Kazakh kind of nationalist sentiment that really wants to decrease Russian and Chinese influence in the country. If you're going to decrease Russian and Chinese influence, who are the only countries that are going to essentially benefit from that? It's the West, right? It's the United
right,
States,
right.
EU. And
Yeah,
so understanding that essentially the only beneficiary of under control Russian and Chinese influence is the West is something that I think alarms both Beijing and Moscow. And there was this idea in Russia, at least, that we really need to make sure Kazakhstan is in a secure place before something happens in Ukraine. And so right now, Tokayev, the Kazakh leader, has not kind of been as pro-Ukrainian as some people might have expected or speculated he could be. He's not like endorsing Russia's actions, but this is a danger for Kazakhstan because Kazakhstan realizes that Russia could do something very similar to Kazakhstan at some point in the future, and all the long-term kind of developments, demographic and so on, suggests that
right.
there's kind of this growing democratic sentiment in Kazakhstan, and it's unclear how Russia and China are going to continue to kind of combat that going forward. Um,
Gotcha. There was one last question probably before we leave, and it was regarded to lifting sanctions and the possibility for a peace treaty. Before we get to the
yeah,
sanctions part, what do you think are the odds for a peace treaty? Period. Because I mean,
yeah.
in the past few days, it's been like Russia asking for the moon and Ukraine saying no, not going to do that, right? So there's not a lot of progress going on. What do you think are the prospects for this going
Yeah.
forward, the peace treaty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely doubtful for at least the next several weeks. The Russia, first off, doesn't want a peace treaty in the near term because they think that they still have more battlefield successes to
They've
come.
got
Yes,
momentum,
they've got momentum. They're about to, for example, a tactical development is the Ukrainian positions in eastern Ukraine are extremely exposed and vulnerable. And once a lot of those Ukrainian forces kind of get cut off and unable to retreat back to western Ukraine, then we're looking at a very difficult situation for Ukraine. So Russia is going to be methodical and is going to try to increase its negotiating position. The problem is that the Ukrainians, they're just worried that if we do some peace treaty, kind of agree to have our territories taken, then
right?
we're not really going to get a guarantee that the Russians stop there. What if in 1, 2, 5, 10 years, however many, they just may they continue to destabilize us, continue to make more territorial demands on us, continue to subjugate us. And so they're kind of
Right.
saying, let's stop this now. Let's try to get the West and tank Putinism and do an armed resistance with effort while
Make
maintaining
Zelensky a
all of our
hero. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
so I mean, I think that's why I don't think a peace settlement is necessarily in sight in the near future. And there's political restraints in Ukraine too. I mean, the Ukrainian people will be very angry with Zelensky if he goes on some kind of peace settlement, at least for now. So I think we're still looking for at least several weeks before we see any kind of significant ceasefire.
Yeah, and I think on that point related to the sanctions, which was the core of this question, is that like we'll have to see what the peace treaty looks like. If it's this incredibly imbalanced, basically Russia gets it once in Ukraine, and this is the new reality, is this sort of puppet state or whatever split state solution. However, this works out, it looks like it's going to work out in Russia's favor, whatever the peace treaty is, and I think the U.S. and the West, NATO, will be hesitant to just accept that and be like, "Oh, well, at least there's peace, right?"
Yeah,
Sanctions don't last forever, so eventually this will fade off. But yeah, I think that'll largely depend on what the peace treaty looks like, and it's looking like a pretty imbalanced treaty.
absolutely. And that's also figuring into Russia's calculus. They're going, oh, I mean, if we've already got all the tough sanctions and they're not going to come off, even after we do some kind of ceasefire or return to diplomacy, then a lot of the near to midterm uh, economic consequences are essentially locked in already. So we might as well
Yeah, you might
go
as well go
for
for
it.
broke.
Yep, exactly.
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I guess we can wrap it up there. I think this was
Yeah,
great.
I think so.
Yeah, obviously, for our listeners, please go to stratfor.com if you want to read more of our analysis of these issues. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back next time.
Thanks, Matt. Hope you get some sleep covering all this Russia stuff every day.
Thanks, Chase.